When the first Sumerian tablets were pulled from the soil near ancient Eridu, something strange surfaced in their silent marks. The wedge-shaped cuneiform lines did not simply list trade goods or hymns to the gods. They told of trembling ground, darkened skies, and an earth wounded by war. These were not metaphors of local conflict or tales of mortal kings. They spoke of a cosmic quarrel, a conflict among the Anunnaki, beings the Sumerians believed were not just divine, but foundational. Cities cracked, winds rose, and etched beneath it all was a whisper. Earth was damaged during a war beyond human scale. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. If the day has been long or your mind restless, you've found a quiet place now. Let the world soften. Tonight, you've shown up for something measured, something thoughtful, and I'm grateful to be the voice beside you as we travel back. Back to a time when memory was clay, and gods might still have walked the riverbanks. This story isn't told in one grand myth. It doesn't announce itself like Gilgamesh or the Tower of Babel. Instead, it lives in scattered fragments, temple inscriptions from Nippur, administrative texts from Lagash, and disaster tablets unearthed near Kish that speak of abandonment, smoke, and sudden departure around 2200 BCE. Most modern scholars attribute these disruptions to climate collapse, specifically the 4.2 kilo-year aridification event. The land dried, trade routes failed, empires fell. That's the academic consensus. But to the Sumerians themselves, these calamities were framed as divine retribution, a celestial war that played out not only in myth, but in earth and stone. Some researchers argue the language is symbolic. Others wonder aloud whether the ancients remembered something more. We won't decide that tonight. That's not the goal. We're not here to prove or disprove. We're here to explore, to sit with the question itself. What did they believe happened? And why did they feel the need to carve it into tablets meant to outlast time? Take a breath, let it settle. Wherever you are listening from, whether you're curled beneath a blanket or walking softly through your home, ease into stillness. You've already done enough today. Just being here is enough. Let the rhythm slow. And if you find these ancient meditations meaningful, this gentle way of returning to the past, consider tapping like or subscribe. It helps others find this quiet corner too. Thank you, sincerely. Now, imagine a dusty room beneath the ruins of a ziggurat. The air holds the faint tang of salt and sun-baked brick. A single oil lamp flickers on the desk of a weary translator, bent over a clay fragment no longer than a hand. The lines pressed into its surface, 3,000, perhaps 4,000 years old, do not shout. They murmur. They describe skies so heavy the stars disappeared, fields drowned not in water, but silence, and cities left, intact, yet emptied, as if the people had simply walked away. The word malamu appears, radiance, not light, but presence, divine and dangerous. Was it a weapon, a celestial event, a metaphor for power slipping from the world? We don't know, but we will walk with the question. To understand the war that may have scarred the earth, we must first return to the world that came before it, a world of rivers, stars, silence, a world untouched, not yet shaken, a world still whole. Let's begin. Long before the first kings carved their names into limestone, before temples rose from clay platforms, before Sumer had a name, the land we now call Mesopotamia was something else entirely. It was wetter, wilder, a restless cradle of rivers, reed beds, and silent migrations. When the last ice sheets began to retreat, around 12,000 years ago, What would become southern Iraq was not yet a cradle of civilization. It was a shifting mosaic of wetlands and floodplains caught in a slow dance between the Tigris and Euphrates. Sediment cores pulled from the Shatt al-Arab Delta show deep layers of silt and plant matter, confirming a region defined not by cities, but by seasonal flood, marsh, and abundance. During this Holocene transition, the world warmed by nearly 4 to 7 degrees Celsius across key latitudes. Sea levels rose by over 60 meters between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE. What had once been dry plains became estuaries. Rivers forked, split, and joined again. The sky was humid, the air teeming with insects, and the earth itself so soft that structures, if any, left almost no trace. But something was there, something human. Near the Zagros foothills, the site of Jarmo offers a quiet whisper from that time. Excavated in the 1940s by Robert Braidwood, this Neolithic village, dated to around 7,000 BCE, revealed circular mud brick houses, stone tools, and fragments of painted pottery. It wasn't a city, but it wasn't mere wilderness either. It was part of a long memory forming, just beyond the reach of modern history. Further west, in what is now Turkey, Çatalhöyük offers even more. Built around 7,100 BCE and occupied for over a millennium, this sprawling site was unlike anything else of its time. No streets, no elite residences, homes stacked against each other like cells in a hive, entered through the roof, walls painted with bulls, leopards, and erupting mountains. In one chamber, a mural that many scholars interpret as the earliest depiction of a volcanic eruption. Was this memory or metaphor? We don't know, but it suggests that even in deep prehistory, the world was being watched, recorded, passed along. Take a moment here. Let the concept of time breathe. We are more than 9,000 years before the reign of Sargon of Akkad, more than 11,000 years before our present moment, and already people were painting fears and memories on plaster. Now consider this. Around 10,800 BCE, the world changed again. A period we now call the Younger Dryas, lasting over 1,000 years, brought an unexpected return of glacial cold. The cause remains debated. Some blame a sudden shutdown of Atlantic Ocean currents. Others propose the remnants of a comet impact, supported by nanodiamonds and magnetic spherules found in soil layers across the northern hemisphere. Whatever the source, the effect was real. Temperatures plummeted, megafauna vanished, and scattered human groups likely endured bitter winds beneath stars they no longer trusted. Could this have been the trauma behind the oldest flood myths? Could this deep memory, passed not in writing, but in whispered story, be what later became the tale of gods angry at human noise? It's possible, because writing came late, but memory came early. Before the invention of cuneiform around 3,200 BCE, people recorded their truths in other ways. Through rock art, like the carved panels of Ain Ghazal in Jordan, human figures with elongated heads and large hollow eyes. Through burial, customs, like the skull caches at Jericho, where faces were remodeled in plaster and placed in homes. Through symbolic tokens made of clay, some spherical, others conical, used, according to archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat, to record quantities and contracts long before written language. We tend to think of prehistory as silent, but it wasn't. It was coded, encoded in stories told by firelight, encoded in symbols pressed into tokens, encoded in the rhythmic pattern of seasonal migration and the layout of homes facing the rising sun. and perhaps encoded in fear. Fear of skyfire, or flood, or invisible forces beyond the forest edge. Is it any wonder, then, that when writing did arrive, it carried not just lists of sheep and barley, but hymns to wrathful gods and tales of cities drowned? The Sumerians believed they inherited a world that had already been broken once. Their earliest myths, those of Enlil, Enki, and the primeval gods, are not tales of joyful creation, but of conflict, rebellion, sacrifice. The god We-Ila is killed so that humans might be formed from his blood and clay. The gods debate whether humans should exist at all, and always there is a memory of flood. These stories emerge suddenly in the written record, but they feel old, too old to have been invented on the spot. More likely, they were remembered. Let's pause for a moment. Are you still with me? Can you feel how far back we've gone? This isn't just the past, it's the before. Before before Eridu, before kings, temples, and stone inscriptions. There was a world of reed and river, of lightning over marshland, of humans looking to the sky and asking why the ground shook beneath them. We may never find a single tablet that explains it all, but we can still listen to soil samples and pollen cores, to cave walls and clay tokens, to stories that echo faintly through millennia. What came before kings and wars wasn't emptiness. It was memory without paper, emotion without alphabet, a world not waiting to begin, but already speaking, just in forms we've only begun to understand. And from that memory, painful, patient, patterned, Sumer would rise. Let's go there next. Let's walk toward the first city, Eridu, where the gods were said to have first descended, and where humans may have first believed the heavens had something to fear. Long before Enlil wielded the Tablet of Destinies, before temples were built in his name and his breath was said to bring the wind, there were older whispers, whispers of beings who were not yet gods, not yet personified, but forces, raw, powerful, nameless. Before Sumer named the divine was still feared. In Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki, the offspring of Anu, stand as a celestial council. Yet even they, the most ancient in the recorded pantheon, seem to have ancestors of thought. Scholars who analyze linguistic strata and mythological evolution note that these gods did not emerge fully formed. Rather, they developed through layers, each god an echo of something older, something harder to name. The idea of Enlil as Sky Lord, for instance, likely arose from earlier deifications of the natural forces themselves: storm, wind, order. Enki, the god of fresh water and cleverness, may reflect even older worship of the subterranean aquifers that gave life in desert lands. These divine figures weren't always anthropomorphic. They weren't gods in the way we often imagine, with robes and temples and family trees. They were principles, systems, powers wrapped in mystery. The earliest myths place Anu at the apex, Anu, god of the heavens, remote, silent, watching. His name appears not only in Sumer, but later in Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian texts, always as the elder power. His presence looms, but his actions are rare. He is the sky itself, constant, cold, distant. From him, it is said, the other gods descend. The Anunnaki are his children, or creations, or aspects. Sources vary, but beneath Anu, something changes. Enlil emerges not just as a sun, but as a force of disruption, the god of air, of breath, of command. In some accounts, Enlil separates heaven from earth, a cosmic act that births space and time. He becomes the king of the gods, not by inheritance, but by action, where Anu watches, Enlil moves, and then there is Enki, the trickster, the counselor, the keeper of the Abzu, the underground reservoir of fresh water and hidden knowledge. Enki does not rule. He balances, he advises, he subverts. Together, Anu, Enlil, and Enki form the triadic foundation of the Mesopotamian divine order. But like many such orders, this one carries tension beneath its surface, because there is rebellion, and the earliest stories are not peaceful. The myth of Enuma Elish, though later Babylonian, inherits its structure from Sumer. In it, the first beings, Apsu, fresh water, and Tiamat, salt water, create younger gods. But the younger gods are loud, disruptive, restless. Apsu seeks to destroy them. Tiamat, for a time, protects them, until she too rises in rage. This theme, of a cosmic parent threatened by its children, echoes through Sumerian myth, and it frames the Anunnaki not just as rulers, but as rebels. In the Atrahasis narrative, which predates the Epic of Gilgamesh, we hear of the Igigi, the working-class gods who labor without rest. They dig canals, they raise embankments, and they grow weary, they rebel. In response, Enki proposes a solution: create humans. Let them bear the burden of labor. A god, We'ila, according to some versions, is sacrificed, his blood mixed with clay. From this, humans are formed, not loved, but engineered. Take a breath here, because this moment, the birth of humans, is not surrounded by joy or divine affection. It is administrative, practical, political. Humans, in Sumerian origin myth, are a labor force born of rebellion. We were made to solve a divine problem, and the gods who made us were already in conflict with each other. What does that suggest about the nature of the world the Sumerians inherited? To them, the divine realm was not a place of serenity. It was a court, a battlefield, a bureaucracy under strain. The Anunnaki held power, but power, as they understood, was rarely shared peacefully. Let's ground this in something physical. On a tablet excavated from the city of Nippur, dating to roughly 2100 BCE, the Sumerian king list connects kingship directly to divine will. It says, "Then kingship was lowered from heaven." Kings were not elected. They were appointed by gods. But those gods had already fought for order. And if gods had to fight for stability, what did that imply about the world humans were born into? The scholar Thorkild Jacobson, one of the foremost interpreters of Mesopotamian religion, described the early pantheon as a divine household, not a harmonious family, but a structure of roles, tensions, and shifting authority. He saw the Sumerian divine as reflections of human political reality, authority contested, duty assigned, loyalty fractured. In this model, the Anunnaki were not beings of pure benevolence. They were reflections of a cosmos in tension. Each role carried power and the threat of imbalance. Some have taken this further. Modern alternative theorists, those outside traditional academia, suggest the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but visitors. Beings of superior knowledge, perhaps celestial in origin, who brought metallurgy, agriculture, and kingship. This theory, popularized by authors like Zecharia Sitchin, interprets the ancient texts as distorted memories of real events. In this view, rebellion among the gods was not myth, but history, a history of hierarchy, experiment, and eventual war. Mainstream scholars strongly reject this. They see such readings as misinterpretations of metaphor, of stories meant to encode meaning, not literal chronology. And they may be right. But the question remains, why did the earliest civilizations, so close to the memory of beginnings, choose to frame their gods as being in conflict? Why was the divine world described not as a harmony, but as a pressure chamber? Maybe the answer lies in experience. The Sumerians lived with floods that drowned fields, with droughts that killed cattle, with rulers who rose and fell like storms. To them, the world was unstable, predictable only in pattern, not in mercy. Their gods mirrored that. Powerful, yes, but also uncertain, divided, prone to arguments with consequences written in weather and war. And in those myths, beneath the violence and tension, there is always one echo, that what happens above happens below. The gods before the gods were a prelude. To what? To the great fracture, to the war not yet named, to a memory that would surface only in fragments, thousands of years later. You've now met them, the architects of heaven's tension, Enlil, Enki, Anu, and the echoes behind them, beings of order and resistance, of creation and consequence. As we continue, we'll follow their shadows into the clay, into the temples, into the warnings left behind, because it is from this divine dissonance that the next war may have begun. Carved into clay, hardened by fire, and buried for millennia beneath windswept ruins, the first recorded memories of divine conflict waited patiently in the earth. They were not written to be read by us, and yet here we are, holding fragments of warning in our hands. The earliest Sumerian and Akkadian myths were not passed down as books. They came to us on clay tablets, small, rectangular objects no larger than a hand span in many cases. Some were only 2 centimeters thick, others stretched to 30 centimeters long. Scribes would press symbols into damp clay with a wedge-tipped stylus made of reed. The resulting script, cuneiform from the Latin cunus, or wedge, was angular, methodical, and deeply pragmatic. It could be etched quickly and read clearly, assuming, of course, you had years of training. These tablets weren't left in the open. They were tucked inside archives, sealed in temple vaults, or stored in clay jars within palace libraries. The most famous were recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Over 30,000 tablets discovered by Austen Henry Layard and Hormuz Rassam in the mid-19th century. Others were unearthed in Eridu, Nippur, and Sippar, cities once vibrant, later silenced by dust. Among these, a few texts shine with particular relevance to the ancient war we now trace. The first is the Atrahasis, dated to around 1700 BCE, though clearly copied from earlier Sumerian materials. It tells the story of a time when the gods themselves labored. The Igigi, lesser deities, toiled in canals and fields until they rebelled. Their burden was unbearable. Their cries rose like smoke. And so the higher gods convened. Enki, ever cunning, proposed a solution: create a being to take the load. Ila, a god of intelligence and leadership, was selected. He was killed, his blood mixed with clay, and from this blend, humanity was shaped. Pause for a moment. We are not born of love in this account. We are born of rebellion as a consequence, and with divine blood not as a blessing, but as a leftover stain. The Enuma Elish, though a later Babylonian composition, approximately 12th century BCE, follows similar themes. In it, Tiamat, the primordial goddess of saltwater chaos, is enraged by the actions of the younger gods. A celestial war unfolds. Marduk, champion of the new order, slays her and fashions the heavens from her split body. Order is created from destruction. Dominion is established through conquest. Humanity, once again, is crafted to serve. In both stories, war precedes civilization. In both, violence is the womb. And then there is the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian flood narrative dated around 2100 BCE, recovered from a tablet fragment at Nippur. It describes a time when humanity had multiplied. Their noise disturbed Enlil. The din of human life, singing, building, existing, rattled the heavens. Enlil, in his anger, sent a flood to destroy them. But Ziusudra, the pious king, was warned. He built a great boat. He survived. The word used for humanity's disturbance, hubbub or noise, has long fascinated scholars. Was it metaphorical? A symbol of arrogance, pride, overreach? Or could it have referred to actual overpopulation, environmental stress, cities expanding beyond sacred limits? There is a passage in Atrahasis where the gods declare, "The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket." It's oddly human, a complaint, a divine sleeplessness. But deeper still, it suggests a boundary crossed. Maybe that noise wasn't just volume. Maybe it was memory. Maybe the act of remembering too much, of questioning divine authority, was itself intolerable. Let's consider the tablets themselves. The clay they used came from alluvial plains, rich with fine silt left by river flooding. Once shaped and inscribed, they were sun-dried or kiln-fired, making them nearly indestructible. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay doesn't decay easily. Fire, even city-destroying fire, often preserved them. Some still carry fingerprints, the impressions of scribes who lived and breathed 5,000 years ago. The script varies by region and period. Early cuneiform, around 3300 BCE, was pictographic, symbols representing objects. Over time, it became syllabic, encoding sound. By 2000 BCE, it had reached peak versatility, capable of capturing poetry, law, astronomy, and myth. And in those myths, war never disappears. Repeated across versions, across centuries, is the cycle. Creation to rebellion to punishment to remaking. Gods revolt. Humans are made. Humans displease. Gods destroy. A few survive. The world begins again. You might wonder, how many times was this cycle believed to have repeated? Some scholars propose that Mesopotamian kings saw themselves not as the beginning, but as restorers. That civilization was something that had once existed, then broken, then reborn. The Sumerians used the phrase Nam-Lugal, the kingship, and described it as having been lowered from heaven, not discovered, not earned, restored. Take a breath. Let your thoughts settle. The clay tells us more than story. It tells us that memory was precious, that myths were a form of preservation, not just of identity, but of warning. The oldest tablets are not adorned with romanticism. They speak plainly. They state lineage, laws, floods, gods. But always, always beneath them is the hum of something larger. Broken stars. It's a term sometimes used poetically by translators to describe the appearance of fragmented astronomical texts. Texts where celestial charts have been shattered by time, their meanings half lost. But metaphorically, it fits. Because these stories are like those stars, scattered, burned, and somehow still glowing. You're holding a piece of one now, in your mind, if not in hand. Picture it, a tablet just 13 centimeters wide, barely thicker than a deck of cards. Etched lines speak of rebellion among gods, of a sacrifice that seeded humanity, of a flood sent not for justice, but for quiet. It sat for thousands of years beneath silt, untouched, then brushed clean by a gloved hand. Now it sits in a museum, under glass, behind lights, but it still remembers, and maybe it still warns. We'll continue soon, because these fragments lead somewhere, to a city, to a temple, to a world that tried to make sense of its damage. But for now, feel the clay, feel the silence that once buried it, and remember, the story was carved not just for remembrance, but so it might be found again. When the ancient Sumerians spoke of beginnings, they did not point to Uruk or Lagash, or even the storied city of Nippur. They pointed south, toward a quiet patch of land near the marshes. They pointed toward Eridu, the city they believed was the first to rise from mud and reed, the first to receive kingship, the first place where gods and humans met without barrier or veil. And when we stand at its excavated mound today, Tel Abu Sharain, worn by wind, flattened by time, it is hard to imagine that this humble rise was once the foundation of an entire worldview. Long before history, Eridu was a whisper, not a metropolis, not a capital, but a seed. Archaeologists began uncovering Eridu in the mid-20th century, peeling back layers of soil like pages in a book, and what emerged was astonishing. Beneath the surface lay 18 superimposed temple phases, each built directly atop the previous one. These layers spanned from the Ubaid period, around 5400 BCE, into the early Uruk period, around 3800 BCE. That means that for nearly 2,000 years, this single site was rebuilt, renewed, and revered. A place like that doesn't just exist, it is maintained. But what was Eridu? Really? Let's slow down. Imagine walking there. You would feel the grit of ancient mud brick under your sandals, the faint pull of marsh air drifting in from the south, and the soft crumble of walls no taller than your knees. The site sits near the old shoreline of the Persian Gulf, though the sea has since retreated more than 100 kilometers. When Eridu was young, water surrounded it. Boats glided through reeds. Fish and date palms were plentiful. Life clustered where fresh water met salt. The earliest Eridu temple was small, only a few meters across, built with simple mud brick. Its altar faced east, likely toward the sunrise. Over centuries, the structure expanded. What began as a modest shrine became a tripartite temple with a central hall, side chambers, and raised platforms. Its orientation remained consistent, as if the builders were aligning not to the landscape, but to a principle, a memory, a command. And presiding over Eridu was Enki, Lord of fresh water, Lord of wisdom, Lord of the Abzu, the subterranean reservoir believed to feed all rivers. Yet there is a tension here, because Enki was also the god who, in myth, defied divine decrees, protected humans, and quietly subverted the will of more authoritarian gods like Enlil. If Nippur represented order and kingship, Eridu represented something gentler, cleverer, and perhaps more rebellious. That tension is woven through the city's architecture. Temples were not only spiritual spaces, they were command posts. The raised platforms offered vantage points across the marsh plains. Storage rooms held surplus grain, fish, and offerings, resources that allowed priests to wield economic power. The central hall, with its fire pit and offering table, could accommodate ritual gatherings. But scholars note something else. The temples also served as administrative nodes. Reed tokens, early counting stones, and clay tablets hint at organized labor and resource distribution. This was not coincidence, it was bureaucracy, the earliest kind. Take a breath here and picture this. A community of perhaps a few hundred people gathers near the temple's base. They rely on priests to declare planting seasons, to interpret omens, to direct canal digging. The temple stands above them, literally and symbolically, just as the gods stand above mortals. This hierarchy is not yet written in law, but it is felt in the rhythm of daily life. In this way, Eridu becomes a reflection of the divine order described in the myths, a cosmos where authority descends from above, where commands flow downward, where rebellion, when it comes, must happen from below. The Ubaid culture that built Eridu spread gradually through southern Mesopotamia. Their homes were rectangular, often with central halls mirroring the temple layout. Their pottery was painted with geometric designs, subtle, methodical, deliberate. Their burial practices show social differentiation emerging gently, not abruptly. No kings, no armies, just steady organization, like a tide slowly rising. But something shifted during the Uruk period. Population increased, communities expanded, standardized bevel-rim bowls appear, mass-produced vessels used to ration grain to workers. This suggests structured labor, centralized control, a society beginning to mirror the stratified pantheon it worshipped. And through all this, Eridu persisted, quietly, patiently, even as Uruk grew into a sprawling hub with monumental architecture and sophisticated writing. Eridu retained its symbolic primacy as the first city. In the Sumerian king list, the text begins with the words, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu," not began, descended. That wording carries weight. It implies that Eridu wasn't chosen by humans. It was designated by gods. But which gods? And why Eridu? Some archaeologists argue its location near abundant marsh resources made it ideal for early settlement. Fresh water, fish, reeds, and stable soil created conditions for sedentary life. But mythologically, Eridu was the seat of Enki. And Enki's nature, clever, oppositional, protective of humanity, stands in contrast to the authoritarian tendencies of Enlil. Eridu, then, becomes more than a settlement. It becomes a statement, a whisper that divine order is not absolute, that there are gods who guide and gods who contest. Let's lean into that whisper, because beneath Eridu's layers, archaeologists found evidence of ritual renewal. Each time a temple phase deteriorated, instead of abandoning it, the community rebuilt directly atop the old foundation. The new temple kept the same alignment, the same proportions, the same symbolic footprint. This pattern persisted for centuries. Why? One interpretation is practical. The site was sacred. You do not abandon a holy place. But another interpretation lies in the mythic symbol of repetition, the idea that Eridu must always return to itself, as if the city embodied a cycle, creation, deterioration, rebuilding, over and over. Does that sound familiar? It's the same cycle we find in the flood myths, the same cycle embedded in divine wars, human creation, and cosmic resets. Eridu was living that story long before it was written. And here is where divine rebellion enters the archaeological record, not through battle scars or inscriptions of conflict, but through silence, through shifts, through absences. Around 3,500 BCE, Eridu began to decline. Its population shrank, its influence waned. Some scholars argue environmental changes drained the marshes. Others suggest political consolidation drew power northward. But there's a third possibility, one tied to myth rather than climate. When Nippur rose as the sacred center of Enlil, the balance of divine authority shifted. Enki's city, the city of generosity, cunning, and subversive knowledge, no longer stood as the first among equals. Authority transferred, kingship moved, and with it, the ideological foundation of Sumer changed. The rebellion wasn't fought with swords. It was fought with temples, with narratives, with shifts of sacred geography. Picture the transition. In Eridu, a temple dedicated to a god of wisdom and protection. In Nippur, a temple dedicated to a god of command and order. The people followed the authority that seemed more aligned with emerging complexity: canals, taxation, agriculture, city walls. But something was lost in the process: a worldview, a gentler hierarchy, a model of divine human relations shaped by cooperation rather than decree. It is no coincidence that myths describing divine conflict intensify in the centuries after Eridu's decline. Stories of gods arguing, of humanity being punished, of cosmic tensions spilling downward. When the earthly reflection of divine harmony fractured, the myths captured the bruise. Take a moment to breathe. You've walked through 6,000 years of turbulence already. Eridu remains quiet now, just a mound, a whisper, a memory of the first city and the divine tensions it reflected. But beneath that silence is a lesson. The earliest civilizations saw themselves not as inventors of order, but as inheritors of conflict. As we continue, we'll move from whispers to warnings, because the next phase of this story, the phase after Eridu, brings us into the age when gods no longer whispered, they intervened. When the early Sumerians spoke about the years before the flood, they described them not with images of violence or rebellion, but with something far stranger: noise. Not the noise of battle, not the noise of ritual, but the noise of human life itself. In the Atrahasis tablets, copied and recopied across centuries, humanity multiplies. They build homes, they farm fields, they celebrate births, and their collective presence, breathing, speaking, moving, creates a rising hum beneath the heavens. The gods hear it, they cannot sleep, and from that sleeplessness, a crisis begins. On the surface, the idea feels symbolic, but the Sumerians meant something particular when they used the phrase rigmu, noise. It wasn't merely sound, it was disturbance, it was imbalance. And imbalance in Sumerian cosmology was dangerous. Take a breath for a moment. Let this idea settle gently. To the people who shaped the world's first cities, the cosmos was not stable by default. It had to be maintained, carefully, ritually, continually. Any disruption, whether natural or human, could ripple upward into the divine realm. So what exactly was humanity disturbing? Let's walk slowly through what the tablets say, and what archaeology suggests. One tablet from the Old Babylonian period states plainly, "The earth grew louder, the gods could not rest." Another describes humans as filling the land like locusts. That imagery underscores rapid population growth around 3000 BCE, when small farming villages became dense urban centers. At sites like Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur, archaeologists find sudden increases in dwellings, expanded irrigation systems, and granaries large enough to store grain for thousands. The noise may have been a metaphor for demographic surge, but something deeper is embedded in the myth. Because the gods' reaction is severe, they don't warn, they don't negotiate, they retaliate. Their first attempt to quiet humanity is a drought. Their second is famine. Their third is plague. Only when all of these fail, only when humans continue to live and multiply and remember, do the gods choose a final measure: the flood. This escalatory pattern mirrors real environmental stresses that we now know reshaped Mesopotamia. Sediment analysis near ancient riverbeds shows long-term droughts in the late 3rd millennium BCE. Archaeological layers in cities like Shuruppak reveal sudden abandonment, water damage, and silt deposits, a literal flood layer. But the myths frame these not as ecological accidents. They frame them as responses to the great noise. So we ask quietly, what was the noise really? Walk with me into a different kind of evidence: soil, pollen, and tree ring data. Around 2600 to 2300 BCE, Mesopotamia underwent significant ecological strain. Reconstruction of climate records shows reduced rainfall, increased salinity in irrigated fields, and deforestation caused by expanding urban populations. As more land was cleared and more canals dug, the delicate water balance shifted. Entire regions became vulnerable to both drought and flood. This was not slow, it was felt. Imagine standing on a field where the soil crumbles like ash from too much salt. Imagine watching a river that once supplied fish turn shallow and brown. Imagine hearing distant cities collapse as resources dwindled. In this context, noise may have been a metaphor for unsustainable growth, the kind that wakes the world, shakes the balance, and forces change. A memory preserved in story long after the cause was forgotten. But there's another layer, one more elusive, one that the Sumerians themselves hinted at. When the tablets say the gods lost sleep, the line can be dismissed as mythic dramatization. But in Sumerian ideology, sleep was more than rest. Sleep meant stability. Sleep meant cosmic equilibrium. Sleepless gods implied a cosmos out of balance. This is where the myth opens a door, not toward supernatural beings, but toward psychological and cultural truth. Urban life brought unprecedented complexity. Crowded streets, constant work rhythms, night fires, rituals, markets. Light pollution and noise pollution existed long before those terms were invented. Even the earliest cities hummed with the restless activity of thousands. Now imagine the worldview of a shepherd or farmer, newly living within stone walls and narrow alleys. Imagine their world becoming louder, faster, more unpredictable. Imagine believing that gods lived just above the sky, watching. The idea that humans woke something hints at a realization. Civilization changes everything. It alters human behavior. It alters the environment. It alters the relationship between people and the divine. To the Sumerians, this was not progress. It was a disturbance that had to be managed. And if humanity was the cause, humanity would bear the consequence. Every aspect of existence has its may. Alter them, disrupt them, or violate them. An imbalance follows. Imagine the meh as cosmic settings, adjusted by gods, manifested on Earth. When myths describe humans multiplying without restraint, they imply the meh governing population, and resource flow had been violated. When humans became too loud, too numerous, too ambitious, they were not breaking rules, they were breaking cosmic law. To restore equilibrium, the divine realm had to intervene. And this is the crux of Section 6. The great noise is not literal. It is a symbol of cosmic imbalance. The Sumerians saw themselves as a species desperate to fit into an ordered universe, yet constantly overflowing the boundaries given. Civilization magnified this tension. When cities grew, their temples grew. When temples grew, their gods grew, along with expectations, obligations, and rituals. The flood myths reflect anxiety, not malice. Humans were not evil. They were not wicked. They were loud. Too loud for a world that demanded balance. Let's take a quiet breath here, a moment of stillness amid ancient tension. Because beyond the ecological metaphors and mythic patterns, there is something haunting. When we compare the Sumerian flood story, the Atrahasis narrative, and the later Babylonian Enuma Elish, the theme is consistent. Something about humanity disrupted cosmic order. Something about civilization crossed a threshold. But what if the Sumerians were remembering an older trauma? Some scholars propose that early myths encode memories of the Younger Dryas, the last major climate whiplash around 10,800 BCE. Others see echoes of massive flooding events at the end of the last ice age. A few point toward a cultural fear that humans, in growing numbers, in their technology and ambition, had become a new and unpredictable force. Whatever the cause, the effect is clear. The stories preserve the feeling of disturbance. Let's return to the myth. The gods cannot sleep. The younger gods complain. Enlil grows angry. Enki grows protective. Humanity becomes the center of cosmic debate. Should they exist? Should they be silenced? Should they be managed? Or should they be destroyed? Now, these are not questions of sound. These are questions of place, of whether humans belonged in a world shaped by forces older than themselves. The Great Noise is the mythic articulation of a realization that all civilizations eventually face. Growth has consequences, ecological ones, social ones, spiritual ones. To the Sumerians, the gods embodied these truths. Their anger mirrored drought, their silence mirrored flood, their decisions mirrored fate. But fate, Shimtu, was not arbitrary. It was written, structured, held in the meh, guarded by gods. When humans disrupted the balance, the gods acted as equilibrium's guardians, not tyrants, not villains, but keepers of order. And now we return to our theme, the ancient war. Because the Great Noise, the disturbance of humanity, was not the first disturbance, nor the last. Some researchers propose that this myth may encode memories not only of human overreach, but of divine conflict spilling into human life. When gods cannot sleep, who caused their unrest? When order collapses, who challenged it? When cosmic law destabilizes, was humanity the catalyst, or simply the first to feel the shock? We aren't here to decide, only to listen, because the Great Noise introduces a pattern. When balance is broken, something rises, something intervenes, something resets the world. In the next section, we'll step into the divine council chambers, into the debate that shaped our existence, and into the conflict whose consequences may still echo in the clay. For now, let the idea drift gently. The first war was not fought with weapons. It was fought with sound, with growth, with imbalance, with the rising hum of a species awakening to itself, and the universe awakened in return, long before the floodwaters rose, before the ark was sealed, before humanity understood the danger gathering above them. The ancient texts describe a moment of stillness, a chamber, a gathering, a decision. It is here, in the oldest surviving narratives of Sumer, that we encounter something extraordinary, a council of gods whose deliberations would shape the fate of the world. And in that chamber, if the stories are to be believed, humanity's existence hung by a thread. The Atrahasis tablets paint the scene with unadorned clarity. The great gods assemble. Their expressions are tense. Their voices carry authority. Enlil, lord of wind and command, enters with fury. Humanity, he argues, has become too numerous, too loud, too disruptive. His sleep has been disturbed, his order unsettled. Enlil's solution is stark, not reform, not guidance, erasure. Yet across the chamber stands Enki, guardian of fresh waters and human creation. He listens, weighing the arguments, refusing to act in haste. Enki, who crafted humans from clay mixed with divine blood, does not easily surrender what he helped shape. His caution is not fear, it is principle. The world thrives on balance, and the destruction Enlil proposes threatens that balance. What follows is not a shouting match. It is negotiation, measured, methodical, like a court or council in deep deliberation. And when you read those lines carved into clay 3,000 years ago, you can almost hear the quiet tension beneath them. Let's pause and reflect. When we imagine gods discussing the fate of humanity, it feels mythical, far removed from the world we know. But this divine council looks strikingly familiar. It resembles a gathering of elders, a royal court, a ruling assembly. The Sumerians, living under priest kings and bureaucratic institutions, understood how power worked. They had seen councils decide irrigation disputes, grain distribution, and matters of war. So when they imagined the gods, they did not imagine isolated, impulsive figures. They imagined a structured body, mirroring earthly government, a council with roles, responsibilities, conflicts, debate. The question naturally arises, did this structure descend from the heavens to humans, or did humans project their own governance into the heavens? We can't know. But the symmetry is undeniable, and Sumer is not alone. In ancient Egypt, the gods assemble to deliberate the fate of humanity after its rebellion in the destruction of mankind myth. In Hindu tradition, the Devas gather to debate cosmic imbalance when humanity or demonkind grows unchecked. In the Hebrew Bible, the divine council appears repeatedly, beings surrounding Yahweh, discussing outcomes for nations and individuals. Every ancient culture, in some form, imagined the cosmos as a place of governance, where decisions were made collectively, not unilaterally. The Sumerian version is simply the oldest one we know, and within it, the debate over humanity is not metaphor, it is existential. According to the Atrahasis tablets, Enlil presents his case first. He cites the great noise, the disturbance of cosmic order, as a threat not only to the gods' comfort, but to the stability of creation itself. For Enlil, the solution is straightforward: reduce humanity. The first measures are controlled disasters, a drought, a famine, a plague. Each is introduced not as punishment, but as cosmic regulation, a rebalancing mechanism. But humans adapt. They pray, they ration, they develop new survival strategies. Their resilience, ironically, becomes a liability. Enlil grows frustrated. His interventions fail. His authority is challenged by the very beings he sought to control. And in that moment, Enlil proposes the unthinkable, the flood. Not a localized event, a total erasure. One tablet describes his command as a sweeping silence, a poetic phrase that scholars interpret as complete annihilation. Yet even in myth, dictators do not rule unopposed. Enki listens, watches, calculates. He understands the imbalance that troubles Enlil, but he sees humanity differently, not as a disturbance, but as a necessary part of creation. Human labor maintains temples. Human rituals sustain divine presence. Human memory preserves cosmic law. Destroying humanity would not restore order, it would shatter it. So Enki challenges the proposal, using caution rather than confrontation. Where Enlil speaks in absolutes, Enki speaks in nuance. Where Enlil demands silence, Enki demands consideration. And that tension, between control and compassion, echoes through every version of the story. Enki's wisdom lies not in disobedience, but in interpretation. He understands that cosmic laws, the May, must adapt when the world changes. Humanity's expansion is not a flaw, it is a transformation. Yet he cannot openly defy the council. To oppose Enlil outright would fracture divine order. So he chooses another path, a whisper, a dream, a warning delivered to Atrahasis, or to Ziusudra, depending on the version. Build a boat, Enki tells him. Make it sealed as a roofed house. When the flood comes, endure. This act, quiet, strategic, compassionate, becomes the fulcrum on which human survival turns. And it reveals something profound about ancient belief, that divine descent was not only possible, but essential. Let's step back and breathe. Flood myths exist across cultures: Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, and many indigenous traditions worldwide. The universality raises a question scholars have debated for over a century. Is the flood a shared memory of real catastrophe, or is it a metaphor for cycles of destruction and renewal? But the texts add another layer: intentionality. The flood is not framed merely as a natural disaster. It is a decision, a vote, a decree, a judgment. If the council is metaphorical, it reflects how early civilizations interpreted environmental trauma, viewing disaster as consequence rather than coincidence. But if the flood is a refracted memory, shaped by millennia of retelling, then the debates of the gods may echo the decisions of real leaders. City, elders, priest-kings, or tribal councils faced with resource collapse. The text leaves room for both readings, and that ambiguity is the heart of its power. Consider how governance worked in ancient Mesopotamia. Before monarchs consolidated power, important decisions were often made by assemblies, groups of elders or heads of households who debated matters of irrigation, land distribution, and defense. The divine council may reflect this structure, a cosmic mirror of earthly politics. But there is another possibility, one that hovers quietly, like a shadow behind the narrative. What if humans imagined councils among the gods because they sensed or remembered that decisions affecting humanity were made by beings with higher knowledge? Not supernatural, necessarily, but superior. Beings whose actions shaped landscapes, weather, and survival. Whether interpreted symbolically or literally, one truth remains. The Sumerians believed that the forces governing their world were not unified. They deliberated, they argued, they disagreed, and humanity lived and nearly died inside that disagreement. Eventually, the council reaches its decision. Enlil, backed by the authority of heaven, issues the decree. The tablet describes it in simple, chilling terms. A storm shall wipe away mankind. The gods seal their pact. They swear an oath not to warn mortals. Silence becomes their weapon. But Enki, operating within the narrow space between obedience and compassion, creates a loophole, speaking not directly to Atrahasis, but through the wall of his house, so he does not violate the letter of the oath. This moment, half rebellion, half compliance, defines the layered ethics of the ancient divine world: authority and dissent, judgment and mercy, order and adaptation, all held in delicate tension. Let's pause here. You've followed a council through deliberation, conflict, and decision. You've walked the boundary between myth and memory. And now, as the gods leave the chamber and the decree spreads like rumbling thunder across the heavens, you can almost sense the world holding its breath. Because the next step is inevitable. The waters will come, the sky will darken, the land will vanish beneath the flood. But before that, there is a single moment of stillness. A moment when humans continue their daily lives, unaware that their fate has already been voted on, written, sealed. And in that moment, we understand why the myths survived. Not to terrify, not to condemn, but to remember. To remember that even in the oldest stories, survival comes not from power, but from wisdom, from dissent, from listening to the whisper that says, prepare. In the next section, we will follow that whisper into the world of clay, blood, and origin, where humanity's creation becomes a crossroads, and its survival becomes a legacy. When the oldest Sumerian creation stories describe the moment humanity came into being, they do not linger on beauty or celebration. They speak instead of a ritual, precise and unsettling, carried out in the dim chambers where the gods weighed their decisions. The Atrahasis tablets describe it plainly. A god, Ila, chosen for his intelligence, was sacrificed. His blood, still warm, was mixed with clay taken from the earth. From that mixture, shaped by divine hands, humanity emerged. It is a stark image, not a miracle, but an equation, not a blessing, but a solution. Clay by itself has no will. Blood by itself has no form. But together, they became a paradox. Mortality infused with something higher, something restless. The Sumerians saw this ritual as the origin of their complexity. Humans could serve the gods dutifully, and yet question them. They could labor with obedience, and still dream of freedom. They were beings pulled in two directions, upward toward aspiration, downward toward dust. Take a breath here. Let the mixture settle in your mind. Clay beneath your nails, a pulse beneath your skin. Clay was familiar. It lined riverbanks, sealed pottery, and formed the bricks of early homes. It was cool to the touch, patient, pliable. Clay symbolized everything temporary, shaped today, cracked tomorrow, easily repaired, easily broken. It was the material of ordinary life. Blood, on the other hand, was sacred. It represented vitality, spirit, intention. The gods possessed it, humans borrowed it. In ritual and myth, blood marked transitions between life and death, purity and defilement, divine and earthly. When the Sumerians imagined mixing divine blood with clay, they were describing a union of two incompatible worlds. And that union defined us. In the texts, Ila's sacrifice is not portrayed as tragic. It is functional. His essence, his intelligence, specifically, is preserved in humanity. This detail matters. It implies that humans were not meant to be mindless workers. They carried within them the spark of reasoning that once belonged to a god. And with that spark came consequences. Because intelligence brings noise, intelligence brings ambition, intelligence brings rebellion. The gods soon discovered that the very quality that made humans effective also made them unpredictable. Humans questioned, they multiplied, they performed rituals but also deviated from them. They obeyed commands but also devised new tools, new strategies, new ways of altering the world. The divine council, which had hoped for compliant laborers, now found themselves facing beings who bore a trace of their own divine restlessness. This dual nature was not a flaw. It was the core of humanity. Clay made us grounded. Blood made us dangerous. And the Sumerians knew it. Their hymns and proverbs speak of humanity's constant tension between duty and desire. One line declares, "Man is the shadow of God, yet his heart is dust." Another warns that the gifts of intelligence come with the burden of suffering, because to understand is to long for more. Let's pause here. You can almost feel the weight of that paradox inside yourself. A mind that reaches upward, a body that returns downward, a life shaped by forces older than memory. Modern scholars sometimes read these myths as metaphors for consciousness itself. The emergence of self-awareness in early agricultural societies. Clay becomes the symbol of our physical constraints. Blood becomes the symbol of awakening, of the moment humans recognize themselves as agents, not merely creatures. But the spiritual implications reach further. Were humans divine accidents, created in haste as a solution to a labor problem? Or were they deliberate creations, crafted with intention, mixed with blood, so that the world would have beings capable of both devotion and invention? The texts never answer directly. They leave the question open. That openness is what makes the myth so haunting. If humans were accidents, then our existence is the result of cosmic improvisation, a side effect of divine politics. But if humans were deliberate, then everything that followed, our noise, our cities, our rebellions, was inevitable, designed, expected, perhaps even desired. You can choose which interpretation speaks to you. Both live in the clay. Both echo in the blood. What we do know is that the Sumerians believed humanity carried a trace of the divine, a fragment of intelligence and purpose that no storm, no flood, no decree could fully erase. Even when the gods grew weary of human noise, even when they resolved to silence the world, humans endured. That endurance, to the Sumerians, was not defiance. It was destiny. As we leave this section, let the image linger, hands pressing divine blood into soft clay, shaping the first awakening, watching it rise. In the next section, we will step into the trembling world that followed, a world where the balance faltered, where the ground shook, and where the consequences of that creation began to unfold. When ancient storytellers described the world shaking beneath the feet of gods, they may have been remembering something the earth itself once declared. Long before scribes pressed wedge-shaped lines into clay, the lands of Mesopotamia were shaped by fault lines, rising waters, collapsing plains, and sudden bursts of fire from the sky. These events weren't abstract. They were physical, violent, unforgettable. And to early humans, the only language powerful enough to describe such forces came from the realm of gods and war. Across the centuries, scholars have examined flood layers, sediment cores, and seismic scars to understand whether geological trauma contributed to the myths of divine conflict. And while we cannot say the earth intended anything, we can point to unmistakable evidence. This region was a landscape in motion. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, shifting unpredictably during the mid-Holocene, carved new channels and abandoned old ones. Entire settlements found themselves gradually drowned, stranded, or left without access to fertile soil. A world that changes beneath your feet leaves marks, not just in clay layers, but in memory. Take a breath here. Imagine the ground settling beneath you, soft mud, warm wind, the distant murmur of a river that might change its course by morning. Geologists have long discussed the possibility that the Black Sea deluge, around 5,600 BCE, had far-reaching cultural echoes. According to the theory, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam near the Bosporus, sending torrents of salty water roaring into a freshwater lake. The event would have been catastrophic for communities along the shore, flooding nearly 100,000 square kilometers. It isn't difficult to imagine how such a disaster, retold for generations, could evolve into a story of gods unleashing the sea. But Mesopotamia had its own upheavals. Earthquake studies in the region show repeated seismic events, tremors followed by liquefaction of the floodplain. When the earth moves beneath a city of mud brick houses, walls collapse with the same suddenness as a divine blow. Ash layers, found in several Ubaid and Uruk sites, hint at fires so intense they charred foundations. Whether sparked by lightning storms, warfare, or accidental destruction, the result was the same: ruin arriving with little warning. When ancient texts speak of weapons of the heavens, scholars often assume metaphor. Yet there are meteorite impact traces across the wider Near East, small, localized, but spectacular enough to inspire stories of fire streaking down from the sky. One iron meteorite found in Anatolia dates to the very era when some of these myths were forming. Early humans saw streaks of flame descending with impossible speed, exploding upon contact, burning everything in reach. To them, it was not a natural phenomenon. It was a weapon in the quarrel of gods. Sumerian hymns and lamentations support this association. One text describes Enlil unleashing a storm of stones. Another speaks of a sky split with fire, and yet another records cities trembling as if struck by the hands of giants. These descriptions are vivid, but they do not speak casually. They carry the weight of lived experience shaped into divine narrative. Let's pause. Close your eyes for a moment. Consider what a world without scientific language must have felt like, where every tremor was intention, every flood was judgment, every streak of lightning was a sign. These interpretations do not diminish the myths, they deepen them. They show how ancient people processed trauma through story. The gods became the interpreters of chaos. The earth became the battlefield, and humanity stood at the center of forces they couldn't fully understand. The connection between geology and myth becomes clearer when we examine the linguistic choices of ancient scribes. Words describing earthquakes often overlap with those used for divine anger. Terms for rivers overflowing blend with metaphors of celestial battle. Even the Akkadian word malamu, often translated as radiance or awe, also describes a terrifying brightness, one reminiscent of lightning or meteor fire. This does not mean ancient people were confused. They weren't misinterpreting the world. They were accounting for it in the most meaningful way available. A sky god hurling fire gives emotional shape to an event that would otherwise feel random. An earth god groaning beneath cities explains tremors more intuitively than invisible tectonic plates. And there is another angle to consider, one more subtle, more haunting. Some researchers propose that early mythmakers viewed the land itself as alive, capable of responding to human actions. When humans multiplied rapidly during the Uruk expansion, building irrigation systems and altering landscapes, environmental stress followed. Floods grew more severe. Soil salinization increased. Ecosystems destabilized. To the people who depended on those systems, it may have felt as though the earth was pushing back, resisting, retaliating. Was this resistance interpreted as divine war? Was the ground itself seen as a participant in cosmic conflict? The texts do not say so directly, but they hint. They speak of earth roaring, mountains rising in anger, and the deep swelling against the gods. These are not metaphors from distance. They are metaphors of relationship. As we leave this section, imagine the land of early Sumer, not as peaceful farmland, but as a landscape shaped by shifting waters, trembling plains, and fire from above. Imagine how those experiences would layer into memory, how memory would become myth, and how myth would guide the stories that survived. In the next section, we'll follow how those stories turn toward divine confrontation, toward a moment when gods debated whether humanity could coexist with a world that seemed always on the edge of breaking. When the ancient tablets describe the flood, they do not treat it as a simple storm or seasonal overflow. They speak of a deliberate act, vast enough to erase nearly every trace of humanity. And across distant regions, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to the early Hebrew world, we find parallel accounts of a catastrophe so immense that entire civilizations remembered it as a turning point between worlds. In the Sumerian version, preserved in both the Atrahasis and the Eridu Genesis tablets, the flood is sent because humans have become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive to divine order. The gods resolved to silence the earth, unleashing waters that would swallow plains, cities, and memories. Yet this divine strike is paired with something unexpected: regret. The tablets describe the gods themselves watching the rising waters with grief, their mouths covered, their tears flowing like fish. Even in myth, destruction carries emotional cost. In the biblical account, the flood is framed differently. Humanity's moral corruption, rather than noise or overpopulation, drives the divine decision. Noah is chosen not for cleverness, but for righteousness. After the waters subside, a covenant appears, promising that such destruction will never be repeated. The emotional pattern mirrors Atrahasis: judgment followed by remorse, ruin followed by renewal. The structure differs, but the arc is familiar. The Indus Valley world, though lacking direct textual myths, preserves flood imagery in later Hindu traditions. Stories of Manu, warned by a mysterious fish, a deluge that cleanses the world, and a new era born from survival. Motive shifts once again. Here, it is not punishment alone, but cosmic reset, as if the universe periodically renews itself through sweeping waters. Different causes, different symbols, yet the emotional core remains shared. Take a slow breath. Here, imagine watching a horizon dissolve into water, the sky reflecting a world without edges, the unsettling quiet after years of human bustle. The emotional weight of these stories goes beyond fear. There is grief, raw, intimate, unmistakable. In the Atrahasis tablet, the goddess Nintu cries for the loss of her creations. The destruction she helped authorize now feels unbearable. She laments the empty land, the silence where villages once stood, the absence of ritual and song. The gods, powerful yet bound by their own decisions, become mourners of a world undone. And then there is the emotional burden carried by survivors: Atrahasis, Ziusudra, Noah, Manu. Across cultures, the lone survivors bear a mixture of gratitude and guilt. They build boats, receive warnings, and endure storms. Yet when the waters recede, they step into a world emptied of familiar faces. The gift of survival becomes a weight, an obligation to rebuild, repopulate, remember. These stories mark the beginning of human responsibility. After the flood, humanity is not just recovering, it is starting over, carrying forward the memory of loss. Let's shift the lens for a moment, moving from myth to earth. Archaeologists have uncovered flood layers across ancient Mesopotamia, distinct sediment bands indicating sudden, powerful inundations. At Shuruppak, Tel Farah, and Kish, layers of river-borne silt interrupt normal habitation debris. Radiocarbon dating suggests some of these floods occurred around 2900 BCE, lining up with the period associated with Sumer's early king lists and flood traditions. These were not global floods, but to the people who experienced them, they felt all-encompassing. When your entire world is a river valley, stretching from horizon to horizon, water rising a few meters turns into a universe-ending event. Villages vanish, fields drown, livestock is lost, trade routes collapse. Memory transforms into myth, not because myth distorts truth, but because it preserves truth in a way that resonates through centuries. Modern geology offers additional clues. During the early Holocene, melting ice sheets caused sea levels to rise more than 100 meters. The flooding of the Persian Gulf basin likely displaced thriving coastal communities, pushing populations inland toward what would become Sumer. If those ancestors carried memories of a drowned homeland, those memories may have fused with later flood events, creating a layered tradition that feels both historical and cosmic. And there is one more thread to consider, one that ties the emotional and geological together. These myths are not only about destruction, they are about reset. After the Sumerian flood, kingship descends from heaven again, marking a new beginning. After Noah's flood, a new covenant establishes renewed order. After Manu's flood, a new cycle of creation emerges. In every version, the world is not ruined. It is reformed. It is a pattern older than writing. Catastrophe followed by renewal. Loss followed by responsibility. Silence followed by rebuilding. The flood is both an ending and a threshold. As we leave this section, imagine the last drops falling from a sky finally clear. Rivers retreating to their channels. Soft mud revealing the outline of a world waiting to be lived in again. The survivors carry the memory of waters, the weight of grief, and the possibility of something new taking shape. In the next section, we will turn to the aftermath, the moment when gods recalibrate their relationship with humanity, and when humans begin rebuilding a world shaped by both trauma and hope. When the flood stories of Mesopotamia turn towards salvation, they do not begin with triumph. They begin with a whisper, slipped through walls or carried in dreams, reaching a single man who listens closely enough to hear what the world is about to lose. In the Sumerian tradition, that man is Ziusudra, later called Utnapishtim in the Aana. Akkadian epics, chosen not for strength or conquest, but for attentiveness. He stands at the threshold between worlds, the last man of the old one, and the first man of what will come next. The instruction he receives is simple but impossible. Build a boat, not a fishing craft, not a river canoe, a sealed vessel large enough to hold the seed of life itself. Take a slow breath here. Picture the gesture, hand smoothing pitch onto wooden beams, river reeds stacked, ropes tightened in anticipation of something unspoken but imminent. The Atrahasis version describes the boat with surprising specificity. It is circular in earlier accounts, rectangular in later ones, coated with layers of bitumen to make it watertight. Dimensions vary across tablets. Some speak of a height equal to its length, others of multiple decks, but the essence remains. It is a floating archive, a container meant not just to preserve bodies, but to preserve memory. Within it, Ziusudra shelters animals, seeds, artisans, and records. The ark becomes a womb of civilization, where future culture waits through the violence of the storm. But it is also something else, something more daring. In obeying Enki's whispered warning, Ziusudra participates in cosmic defiance. The divine council had decreed silence, total silence. No warnings, no rescues, no survival. Enki found a loophole. He did not warn Ziusudra directly, but spoke to the wall of his house, and the man overheard. This clever bending of the decree is one of the most human moments in the entire mythological corpus. A god weighing compassion against bureaucracy. A mortal choosing action over despair. A world on the edge of disappearance, saved not by divine consensus, but by quiet dissent and the courage to listen. Let's pause. Feel that tension. the flicker of rebellion hidden within obedience, the bravery concealed inside a simple construction task. The boat becomes a message, not of disobedience, but of interpretation. If humans were created to serve, then their survival might be part of serving. If humans carried divine intelligence within them, then perhaps the gods should have expected them to find a way. The flood tests not only humanity's endurance, but its readiness to bear responsibility for its own continuation. The text described the storm as overwhelming. Winds roar like lions. Darkness blots out the horizon. For 7 days, sometimes longer, the world dissolves into churning water and unbroken sky. Inside the sealed boat, Ziusudra hears the cries of the earth, the groaning of beams, the shifting of cargo that represents everything worth saving. And yet, he stays the course. He steadies the ark. He becomes, in that moment, the axis around which civilization will turn. When the storm finally breaks, the silence that follows is not peaceful. It is eerie. The gods themselves are disturbed by what they have done. In the Atrahasis tablet, Nintu, the mother goddess, laments the extinction she helped orchestrate. Other gods gather like flies around the sacrifice Ziusudra later offers, as though starvation and shock have humbled them. Their regret is not solely for the destruction. It is for the absence that followed. The silence of the flood was absolute. No prayers, no smoke from temple hearths, no festivals or offerings or songs. The world had gone still, too still. This silence reveals something profound about ancient belief, that humans were not just servants, but participants in the cosmic order. Their rituals nourished the gods. Their presence filled the world with meaning. When they vanished, the divine realm felt the loss. Ziusudra's emergence from the ark breaks that silence gently. His first act upon touching dry land is to offer gratitude, a sacrifice that reconnects heaven and earth. And in that gesture, the relationship between gods and humans shifts. The divine council realizes that the world without humans is not a corrected world, but a diminished one. In the Sumerian tradition, Ziusudra is granted eternal life. In the Akkadian version, Utnapishtim is taken to the mouth of the rivers, a liminal place between mortal and divine realms. In the biblical echo, Noah becomes the father of nations. Different endings, same recognition. Survival itself becomes sacred. The ark, then, is not just a refuge. It is a decision, a statement that the human story will continue whether or not the cosmos approves. In that sense, Ziusudra represents the first act of human autonomy in mythic time. He accepts the warning, bears the burden, and becomes responsible for the future. The gods may command storms, but humanity chooses continuity. As we move into the next section, imagine the ark drifting toward a quiet shoreline, waters withdrawing, the world waiting to be rewritten. The flood was judgment, but the survival was meaning. And from that meaning, the next chapters of civilization begin to rise again. When the world dried after the flood and the first cities rose again along the plains of Sumer, people did something remarkable. They began building ziggurats, vast, stepped platforms of mud brick and baked clay, rising tier by tier toward the sky. These structures did far more than anchor cities. They were monuments of memory, shaped by a people who had witnessed their world nearly torn apart. To understand why they built upward, we have to understand what they feared might return. The earliest ziggurats stand over layers of flood-deposited sediment, their foundations carefully placed on stabilized platforms, as if the builders were compensating for an earth they no longer trusted. Archaeologists studying sites like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur have noticed a striking pattern. The earliest construction phases show meticulous leveling, as though the memory of shifting land and rising waters lingered in the cultural subconscious. In their bricks, arranged with precision and ritual intent, you can almost hear an echo, a reminder that the ground had once betrayed them. Take a slow breath here. Imagine standing beside one of these ancient platforms, warm brick under your palm, wind carrying dust along the steps that once led priests skyward. Each ziggurat was not just an architectural achievement, it was a response to instability, a response to divine judgment, a response to a world that had nearly vanished. To climb a ziggurat was to move closer to the realm of gods, to stand elevated above the plain where floodwaters once crept in silently. The structure served as both sanctuary and symbol, a place where humans might reconnect with the divine, not in fear, but in negotiation. Many ziggurats show astronomical alignments, their corners oriented with cardinal directions, their terraces designed to catch particular angles of light at solstices and equinoxes. Scholars studying the ziggurat of Ur noted that its axes align within a few degrees of true north. This wasn't accidental. It suggests that the builders were anchoring human life to cosmic order, re-establishing a connection between the heavens and the earth that the flood had threatened to sever. And this raises a question. Were ziggurats attempts to stabilize a world that felt geologically and spiritually fractured? Some researchers think so. Sacred geometry appears in the dimensions of multiple ziggurats, the ratio of terrace heights, the standardized brick sizes, the recurring use of 7 levels. These patterns carry symbolism: 7 layers for the heavens, 7 for the cosmic mountain, 7 for the stages of creation. Geometry becomes theology. Mathematics becomes memory. You can picture the logic. If the flood was a cosmic reset, then reconstruction must follow cosmic principles. If destruction came from imbalance, then renewal must be grounded in symmetry. Still, there is something even deeper beneath these monumental platforms, literally and figuratively. Modern, ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys at ziggurat sites reveal older foundations beneath newer tiers, sometimes 2 or 3 building phases stacked like sediment. Each phase carries clues: burned layers, subsidence cracks, reinforcement walls. These reveal generations returning to repair, elevate, and strengthen their sacred structures. It is as if the people understood that memory itself required maintenance. Let's pause. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture workers carrying baskets of clay up ramps, chanting under the sun, shaping bricks that connect them to ancestors who survived the flood. What exactly were they preserving? Perhaps it was gratitude, perhaps fear, perhaps a lesson. That stability must be built deliberately, layer by layer. Ziggurats may also encode the story of the flood itself. Their steep sides resemble mountains, natural refuges during inundations. Their heights evoke the legendary peaks on which survivors landed when waters receded. Their ascending stairways mirror the journey from chaos to calm, from ground-level danger to elevated safety. In this sense, the ziggurat is both memory and antidote. The memory: humans once stood at the mercy of waters and divine storm. The antidote: build high, build strong, build in harmony with the stars. Some scholars go further, proposing that ziggurats functioned as early seismographs of a kind, their cracking patterns revealing stresses in the land. Whether or not this was intentional, the structures do record the Earth's movements, their fractures, their repairs, Their modifications all reflect the ongoing relationship between human builders and a shifting world. And then there is the symbolic heart, the summit shrine. A small, intimate room at the top of an enormous platform. A place where heaven and earth were believed to meet. A place where, after the flood, humans could stand once more in dialogue with the divine. When you look at the ziggurats through this lens, they cease to be simple temples. They become encoded stories, translated into architecture, stories of fear remembered and fear overcome, stories of survival transformed into stone and brick, stories of a world rebuilt deliberately so it might never fall so completely again. As we move into the next section, we'll shift from architecture to symbolism, exploring how myths, rituals, and cosmic interpretations evolved after the flood, and how ancient people sought not only to remember, but to understand what had nearly destroyed them. When archaeologists brush away the last layer of dust from a newly uncovered tablet, there is always a moment, soft, almost reverent, when everyone present wonders if this is the one, the missing link, the forgotten account, the echo of a story we have only seen in fragments. Ancient Mesopotamia taught scholars to expect such surprises, because the people of Sumer and Akkad believed something profound, that knowledge existed long before humans learned to write, and that the earliest tablets were only copies of something older, something cosmic, something inscribed before the foundations of the world. It is an unsettling idea, yet it appears in multiple Akkadian texts, references to lost tablets, hidden decrees, inscriptions held in heavenly vaults or buried beneath temples. These mentions are brief but persistent. A king prays to a deity for the tablet of destiny. A priest records rituals meant to reveal the writing beneath the earth. A scribe laments that a portion of the story was lost when the tablets cracked. Through these scattered clues, we sense a cultural conviction that what survived in clay was only the surface. Beneath that surface lay layers of earlier truth, older stories, earlier memories, perhaps messages passed down across cycles of destruction and renewal. Let's take a breath here. Imagine lowering a lamp into a dark archive chamber, walls lined with clay, each tablet holding a voice that slept for 5,000 years. Part of this belief stems from how Sumerians understood writing itself. They saw cuneiform not as invention, but as revelation, a rediscovery of knowledge that already existed in divine realms. The gods, they said, recorded cosmic laws on tablets long before humans walked along riverbanks. These laws governed fate, kingship, storms, destinies, and the rise and fall of civilizations. Humans, in shaping clay with reeds, were not creating new meaning. They were joining a conversation that began in mythic time. This worldview casts libraries as sacred spaces, repositories where human and divine memory overlap. The scribal schools of Nippur, Ur, and Sippar did not merely store texts. They curated an inheritance believed to originate beyond mortality. Every tablet was a time capsule, a fragment of cosmic order pressed into earth. But the most intriguing references come from later Akkadian epics, which speak of tablets hidden beneath other tablets, layers of inscription that only the initiated could interpret. One damaged fragment describes a deep archive sealed under a temple foundation, containing writings placed before the deluge. Another claims that a ruler uncovered a tablet inscribed by the Ancient Ones, a phrase scholars still debate. Was it metaphor? Or did the scribe believe he held something genuinely old, older even than his city's earliest kings? Modern archaeology complicates the mystery in unexpected ways. Across ancient Mesopotamia, excavation has revealed multiple strata of libraries, newer collections placed atop older ones, tablets recopied, edited, overwritten, or placed inside protective boxes. Over time, some tablets became foundations for later structures, quite literally forming layers beneath layers. This physical reality mirrors the mythic idea, knowledge buried under knowledge, waiting for rediscovery. And there is another dimension, one that feels almost uncanny. Every major Mesopotamian site still contains sealed rooms that have never been opened. Some were intentionally bricked shut in antiquity, perhaps as offerings, perhaps as protective archives. Ground-penetrating scans suggest chambers filled with clay tablets that have not seen light in 4,000 years. These unopened spaces raise a tantalizing question. What messages lie inside? What wars? What decisions? What cosmic explanations that ancient scribes believed too significant or too dangerous to lose? Pause for a moment. Feel the weight of time in that question. Imagine a tablet no human has read since the age of pyramids, its symbols still crisp beneath layers of silence. The idea of cosmic codes may sound modern, but to the Sumerians it was foundational. They believed reality itself operated according to decrees, meh, inscribed by the gods. These decrees structured culture, kingship, craftsmanship, truth-telling, justice, ritual. But they also structured cosmic order, the movement of stars, the cycles of seasons, the boundaries between earth and sky. In myth, when these decrees were stolen or corrupted, the world faltered. When they were restored, harmony returned. This worldview blurs the line between myth and memory. If the flood represented divine recalibration, perhaps the rebuilding required rediscovering or rewriting these cosmic instructions. In that sense, every tablet unearthed becomes both artifact and symbol, a reminder of what was preserved and a hint of what was lost. We should also consider the tablets as war memory. Many myths of divine conflict, gods quarreling, councils debating, worlds reshaped, may reflect trauma experienced by early civilizations. Wars between city-states, incursions by foreign powers, or natural disasters could all be encoded into the stories. Over generations, scribes distilled these memories into narratives that felt both historical and cosmic. The tablets beneath tablets, then, are more than archives. They are psychological layers, human attempts to understand upheaval by embedding meaning in clay. As we close this section, picture an archaeologist's hand turning over a newly exposed tablet, its edges worn, its script still legible. Behind that object stretches a lineage of scribes, storytellers, priests, and survivors, each adding a layer to a structure of memory as complex as the ziggurats themselves. And somewhere beneath our feet, in chambers yet unopened, the next layer waits. In the following section, we'll shift from hidden archives to celestial symbolism. How ancient people looked upward after the flood, searching the stars for patterns that might explain the forces shaping their world. When the first generation stepped out onto dry soil after the deluge, they carried with them memories too large for ordinary speech. The world they had known was gone. The people they had loved were gone. Even the shape of the land had changed. Rivers wandering in new directions. Shorelines pulled back like a curtain, revealing unfamiliar earth. And yet, in the centuries that followed, something curious happened. The memories of catastrophe did not vanish, but they softened, they folded inward, they settled into ritual and symbol, wrapped quietly inside practices that outlasted the stories that once explained them. Every civilization that experiences collective trauma must answer the same question: what do we keep? And what do we allow ourselves to forget? The Sumerians, perhaps more than any other ancient people, understood that memory is both a burden and a tool. Their early hymns speak of the days of darkness, yet by the time city-states flourished again, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, most public rituals no longer describe the catastrophe directly. Instead, they preserved gestures, offerings poured at dawn, incense burned at specific thresholds, water libations that echoed the receding flood without naming it. The rites became vessels for memory, but the explicit story grew distant. Take a breath here. Imagine standing in a temple courtyard as priests pour water from a copper vessel, the liquid shimmering before soaking into the earth. A small reenactment of something the participants no longer consciously recall. Anthropologists call this sacred forgetting, a process where communities allow painful memory to shift from narrative to ritual. The story is not erased, it is relocated. It becomes embodied rather than spoken, enacted rather than explained. In Mesopotamia, shrines persisted for centuries, with no clear record of why specific offerings were required. At Nippur, archaeologists found altars layered with ash from offerings repeated for generations, long after the myths that justified them fell out of active telling. People remembered that something must be honored, though they no longer remembered exactly what. This dynamic appears everywhere. A ritual survives because it once answered fear, but eventually the fear fades, leaving the ritual as a shell of meaning. Some scholars suggest this is precisely what happened after the so-called Divine War. If the Sumerians inherited stories from survivors who lived through seismic upheaval, celestial fire, or devastating flood, then the earliest generations would have clung to these stories fiercely, warnings etched into their identity. But by the third or fourth generation, the emotional urgency diminished. Memory became tradition. Tradition became custom. Custom became background. And in that transition, a paradox took shape. Humanity remembered the flood, but forgot why it came. Let's pause. Think of how families speak of grandparents who endured war or famine. The first generation speaks with tears. The next speaks with reverence. The third knows only fragments. The fourth remembers nothing except a holiday menu or a phrase whose origin nobody questions. Civilizations behave similarly. Some ancient offerings, the pouring of water, the washing of statues, the annual lamentations, may have originally been responses to catastrophe, meant to appease forces that once seemed hostile. Over centuries, those actions remained while the emotional charge behind them eroded. In this sense, perhaps humanity did choose to forget, not to erase the past, but to make life livable again. There is also a psychological angle the tablets hint at indirectly. When people experience overwhelming trauma, forgetting becomes a survival strategy. Myths are not simply stories. They are containers for experience too immense to articulate. A tale about gods arguing, waging war, or unleashing floods can encode emotional truth without forcing listeners to confront personal grief head-on. It becomes easier to say, the gods did this, than to dwell on lives lost or landscapes reshaped beyond recognition. This is not deception. It is adaptation. Ritual, in this framework, becomes a form of gentle remembering. Every temple rebuilt after destruction, every festival reenacted, every lament sung in a minor key, carries forward echoes of events long moved out of conscious awareness. The people did not erase the trauma, they distilled it. At certain sites, Eridu, Shuruppak, Ur, archaeologists find repeated phases of reconstruction over older burned or flooded layers. Each rebuilding represents both resilience and forgetting. The new city stands on the ruins of the old, yet the inscriptions rarely mention what came before. It is as though speaking too clearly of the past might invite it back. There is a line in a late Sumerian lamentation that reads, "The heart remembers what the tongue dare not speak." It is a striking acknowledgement of collective memory that persists beneath words. Pause once more. Imagine a festival in Ur, drums echoing across courtyards, priests chanting lines preserved for 5 centuries. The participants know the cadence by heart. They do not know, nor need to know, that the ritual began in response to a war between sky and earth, real or mythic, that once shattered their ancestors' world. In this section of the story, we understand not only what was remembered, but how it was remembered, through silence, through repetition, through architecture, through offerings. These forms of memory carry a gentleness that raw storytelling cannot. As we move into the next section, we will explore how this forgetting shaped a new kind of wisdom, how ancient people began looking upward again, searching the sky for signs, patterns, and reassurance that the forces that once unmade their world might now be understood, or at least anticipated. When we reach this point in the story, where myths speak of gods clashing, storms unleashed, and humanity nearly erased, the natural question floats quietly to the surface. Was there ever truly a war? A war among divine beings? A war remembered through trembling earth and rising waters? A war encoded into stories that far outlived the cities that first told them? Historians approach this question with caution. Their tools are tangible: ceramics, radiocarbon dates, soil samples, inscriptions. But the ancient world often communicates in metaphor, in symbols, in layered narratives shaped by centuries of retelling. What we call evidence in modern scholarship is not the same thing ancient people considered evidence. They lived in a world where the boundary between natural force and divine intention was permeable, where a storm might be both meteorological and moral, where memory and meaning fused into single stories. Let's start with the traditional scholarly view. Most historians argue there was no literal war among gods, no cosmic battle as a historical event. They suggest that the divine conflict described in Sumerian tablets represents a symbolic framework to explain environmental upheaval, political turmoil, or theological shifts. In this reading, Enlil's wrath becomes a metaphor for destructive floods. Enki's descent symbolizes cultural or priestly factions preserving old traditions amid change. Fire from the sky becomes a poetic rendering of lightning, meteors, or warfare. It is a sensible interpretation, grounded, cautious, consistent with archaeological method. But then another view rises, quiet, persistent, harder to dismiss. Some researchers point to the global pattern of myths describing celestial conflict and near-extinction events. A war in the heavens in the Greek Titanomachy, a world-destroying conflict in the Indian Mahabharata with descriptions of weapons bright as suns, a lost civilization drowned after divine anger in the Atlantis account, a battle between sky gods and shadow beings in early Egyptian cosmology. Cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years describe scenes that feel strangely parallel. The earth trembling, the sky darkening, weapons of unimaginable force, a small group of survivors who rebuild. Does this prove a literal, ancient war, No, but it complicates the historian's dismissal. Take a moment. Let that complication settle. Sometimes the question itself is more revealing than the answer. In evaluating ancient memory, one must ask, what counts as evidence? Is a flood layer enough? Is a myth enough? Is a cluster of cross-cultural parallels a coincidence or a pattern? Historians lean on material remains because they endure, but oral tradition endures too, differently, subtly, shaped by human need rather than sediment. When a tale survives for 5,000 years across languages and empires, it suggests it carried something communities refuse to let die. That something may not be a literal event. It might be an emotional truth, a cultural trauma, or a symbolic lesson. Still, the persistence of these myths invites wonder. And that brings us to one of the historian's deepest dilemmas. Ancient people did not divide their world into mythic and historical. To them, story was a vessel, not a category. Memory lived in narrative form, shaped not by accuracy, but by meaning. So when we ask, was there ever a war? We are also asking, what kind of truth are we looking for? Let's pause here. Take a gentle breath. Let your shoulders drop. This is not a moment for certainty. It is a moment for reflection. Another angle emerges from interdisciplinary research. Archaeology paired with geology, climatology, and anthropology. Around 3,200 to 2,200 BCE, the Near East experienced dramatic shifts, drought cycles, resource shortages, mass migrations, city collapses, civil wars over irrigation rights. To a society whose cosmos was populated by gods, these upheavals did not look random. They looked intentional. They looked like conflict in the heavens spilling onto Earth. And so, the myth of the divine war might encode a collective memory of centuries-long instability, distilled into a narrative simple enough to carry forward. But there is also the seeker's perspective. The listener who senses that myth sometimes points towards something we cannot fully articulate. Not literal gods clashing with weapons, perhaps, but forces, beings, or events beyond ordinary human comprehension. The universe has always been larger than our language. Ancient people may have encountered phenomena, meteors, solar events, volcanic plumes, unexplained lights, that demanded stories powerful enough to make those experiences bearable. The truth may lie somewhere between metaphor and memory. And that brings us to the final, quiet question of this section. What is our responsibility when we do not know? For historians, the responsibility is to remain honest, acknowledging uncertainty without filling it with fantasy. For seekers, the responsibility is to remain open, allowing wonder without insisting on answers. For storytellers, the responsibility is to carry the fragments forward, maintaining their integrity, even when meaning shifts across generations. Ancient Sumerians lived with uncertainty, too. Their tablets contain hesitation marks, erased lines, corrections, margins where scribes added alternate versions. They understood that truth is layered, and that remembering does not require certainty. As we leave this section, let the question linger, not as a burden, but as an invitation. Was there ever a war? Perhaps not in the way the stories tell it. Perhaps not in the way we imagine it now. But something happened. Something the earth remembered. Something the people shaped into myth because myth was the only vessel strong enough to hold it. In the next section, we'll turn toward legacy, toward what survived not only in clay, but in the quiet structures of human thought, belief, and curiosity that still guide us today. When you read the Sumerian tablets closely, really closely, Something unexpected begins to surface beneath the familiar stories of divine authority. A subtle tremor, a quiet reversal, a pattern, suggesting that, at certain moments, it was not humanity who feared the gods, but the gods who feared humanity. This idea appears not in a single dramatic passage, but in the tone of deliberations, in the urgency behind divine decrees, and in the punishments that look less like moral correction and more like containment. What were the gods afraid of? Noise, numbers, rebellion, or something far more profound, human potential? Take a slow breath here. Let the possibility expand gently in your mind. The Atrahasis epic recounts that humans multiplied so rapidly their presence disturbed the gods' rest. But noise feels like a metaphor, too thin a reason for near extinction. The tablets hint at something deeper. Humans were becoming too capable. They irrigated lands previously barren. They built cities that expanded beyond what the gods had anticipated. They developed technologies, plows, kilns, mathematics, that altered their relationship with the natural world. In other words, humanity was stepping into power. And power, even in myth, demands response. Ancient texts across cultures reinforce this uneasy dynamic. In the Greek myth of Prometheus, gods punish humanity not for misdeed, but for acquiring fire, knowledge, skill, independence. In the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel story describes humanity building upward, unified in language and purpose. The divine response is not wrath, but apprehension. Nothing they plan will be impossible for them. So the gods intervene. They confuse language. They disperse the people. They contain potential. This theme echoes Sumer's own narratives. When humans grew clever, when they adapted to famine by applying ingenuity, when they resisted catastrophe through cooperation, Enlil escalated his measures. His punishments were not instructional. They were preventative. The flood, viewed through this lens, becomes an act of containment rather than moral correction. Let's pause. Notice how that shifts the emotional tone of these myths. A teacher instructs, a judge disciplines, but a fearful ruler suppresses. The gods in these stories act less like moral arbiters and more like anxious overseers trying to maintain a hierarchy that feels increasingly fragile. Some scholars propose that these themes reflect very real political systems, early priest kings attempting to regulate growing populations. But others point toward a symbolic tension between humanity and forces that once dwarfed us. The more humans learned about seasons, astronomy, agriculture, the smaller the gap between mortal and divine realms appeared to become. And in myth, that shrinking gap becomes threat. Across Sumerian literature, we find stories where divine punishment comes not because humans erred, but because humans succeeded. A shepherd who prospers too quickly draws divine jealousy. A king whose wisdom rivals the gods is described with caution. Even Gilgamesh, part divine, part human, pursues knowledge that unsettles cosmic balance. His journey to Utnapishtim is framed as transgression against limits the gods prefer to maintain. So this raises a question worth sitting with gently. Were the ancient stories warning us not to awaken too fully? Not in the modern sense of technological awakening, but in the spiritual and existential sense, the awakening of autonomy. Ancient societies understood that power brings responsibility, and responsibility brings danger. If humanity realized its full potential without humility, without restraint, without alignment with cosmic principles, then imbalance might return. Flood might return. The quiet between worlds might shatter again. In that sense, the myths serve as reminders of self-limitation. They whisper that certain boundaries exist not to restrain growth, but to protect harmony. Humans may have divine blood in their veins, metaphorically speaking, but they must temper that spark with humility, or risk repeating cycles of destruction. Another way to view this is psychological. Trauma survivors often develop protective patterns, limiting behaviors that once kept them safe. Early civilizations, having endured floods, quakes, migrations, might have projected similar instincts onto their gods. The gods fear humanity awakening again, because awakening once coincided with catastrophe. These fears become encoded into myth, shaping the ethical frameworks of societies long after the original memories fade. Pause again. Feel the quiet around that idea. Sometimes fear is simply memory trying to protect the present. Still, it is difficult to ignore the mythic pattern where human resilience unnerves divine authority. When humans survive drought through innovation, the gods escalate. When humans adapt to plague through cooperation, the gods escalate. When humans survive the flood through wisdom, the gods regret, not the survival, but the loophole that made survival possible. It is almost as if humanity demonstrates something the gods had not predicted, that we could learn, that we could adapt, that we could persist beyond intended limits. And once beings, mythic or mortal, realize that control is slipping, fear naturally follows. This does not make the gods villains. It makes them characters caught in a dynamic much older than writing, the dynamic between creator and creation, order and possibility, fear and freedom. As we close this section, consider this gentle reflection. What if these ancient stories are not warnings from gods to humans, but reminders from ancestors to themselves? A message that power must be balanced, that knowledge must be paired with humility, that awakening without wisdom can fracture worlds. In the next section, we will shift toward legacy, toward the stories, practices, and philosophical questions that survived long after the gods stopped speaking and humanity began shaping its own destiny. When we look back across the long arc of time, it becomes clear that the ancient stories of Sumer did not vanish with the cities that first whispered them. They survived through clay tablets, oral traditions, carving techniques, and ritual gestures that outlasted their original meanings. Memory endured not because every detail was preserved, but because communities carried forward the emotional weight of what their ancestors experienced. Even when the language changed, the symbols softened, and the rituals shifted, something essential continued living quietly beneath the surface. Across centuries of transmission, scribes copied older narratives onto fresh tablets, preserving lines even when they no longer grasped the context behind them. Priests recited hymns whose origins stretched into forgotten ages, their voices echoing across courtyards just as water once echoed through the canals of Ur. And families retold fragments of myths beside evening fires, weaving together pieces of stories that helped them understand why the world felt fragile yet enduring. This is how memory survives. Layered, adaptive, always reshaping itself while holding on to a core that refuses to fade. Even now, archaeologists kneel in ancient ruins, lifting tablets whose symbols still feel sharp beneath the fingertips. Some of these texts come from libraries sealed intentionally during invasions, some from riverbanks that collapsed under shifting water, and some from private homes where a single scribe kept records no one else ever read. Each tablet is a voice returning across millennia, a reminder that humanity has always sought meaning, connection, and continuity. Still today, new fragments emerge from Abu Salabik, Tel Brak, and Nippur, expanding our understanding of how early people interpreted the forces that shaped their world. Modern technology deepens this rediscovery. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried foundations. CT scanning exposes inscriptions inside corroded tablets, and satellite imaging outlines vanished river paths that once sustained kingdoms. Even now, scientists are uncovering environmental data that aligns with ancient accounts of droughts, floods, and geological shifts. These tools allow us to see the world beneath the myths, yet the myths themselves continue to hold truths that no measurement can fully replace. The stories remain not because they are literal, but because they capture something enduring about how humans face mystery. When we compare ancient fears to our own uncertainties, a quiet continuity appears. The stars above us shimmer with the same light that guided early astronomers on ziggurat terraces. The cycles of drought and rain still carve patterns into landscapes, just as they did 5,000 years ago. Even now, communities rebuild after disaster, retell stories to make sense of upheaval, and search for meaning in forces beyond their control. The patterns shift, but the impulses remain. In that sense, remembering the ancient flood or the divine council becomes a way of remembering ourselves. There is also a legacy in the questions the myths leave unanswered. Did a war among divine beings truly occur? Or were these narratives reflections of natural disasters, refracted through spiritual imagination? Still today, scholars debate the scale of the flood, the origins of the earliest gods, and the relationship between mythic memory and historical reality. The unanswered questions do not diminish the value of the story. They extend it. They allow curiosity to remain alive. They invite us to continue the search. Even now, when you listen to these stories in the quiet of evening, you join a lineage stretching back to the first storytellers of Eridu and Uruk. You are participating in the same act of remembrance that preserved these myths across empires, collapses, and rediscoveries. Just as ancient people gathered to retell the flood or the creation of humanity, your presence becomes part of the continuity that carries these ideas forward. The story has survived because listeners keep choosing to listen, and perhaps that is the truest legacy. Not the tablets, though they endure. Not the ziggurats, though their outlines remain beneath shifting sands. The real legacy is the ongoing conversation between past and present. It is the curiosity that rises when we look at old myths and sense something familiar. It is the recognition that even after thousands of years, humanity is still asking the same questions, still seeking the same reassurances, still wondering about creation, destruction, survival, and purpose. As we move toward the final section, let this idea settle gently. The ancient story continues, not in the clay or the ruins, but in you, the listener. The inheritor of questions that have traveled across time, survived flood and fire, and still whisper into the quiet moments of the night. As we come back to the quiet of the present moment, the long arc of the story softens, becoming something gentler than myth and broader than history. Are here now, breathing in a room shaped by your own life, yet carrying echoes from ages far older than memory. The journey through floods, councils, and forgotten cities settles into stillness, reminding us that all ancient stories eventually return to this quiet place where listening becomes its own kind of understanding. And even now, with the night resting around you, the past feels close enough to touch. The stars above you remain almost unchanged from the nights when Sumerian astronomers traced their paths across the sky. Their light falls over us in the same patient way, crossing distances so enormous they dissolve the urgency of our questions. Stone endures with similar calm, holding fragments of writing, hints of ritual, or impressions of fingers that shaped clay long before our time. These constants remind us that while civilizations rise and fall, a deeper continuity moves quietly beneath everything we know. Still today, that continuity invites us to breathe a little slower, to imagine a wider horizon. Some mysteries remain unresolved, and there is a quiet comfort in that. Not every tablet will be found. Not every layer of sediment will reveal its story. Not every myth will align cleanly with history. And yet, this uncertainty does not diminish our connection to the past. It deepens it. Even now, scholars kneel in ruins hoping for a missing shard, while storytellers look to the same ancient lines and wonder about the intentions behind them. Accepting that some answers will stay hidden allows the mind to rest, held gently by the idea that mystery has always been part of what makes us human. If you sit with the silence for a moment, you might notice how time seems to fold a little. The present drifts toward the past, and the past drifts back toward you, meeting somewhere in the middle. Just as rivers shift their paths, yet continue flowing, the stories of old return in new forms while keeping their ancient rhythm. Even now, as you listen, a soft continuity links your breath to those who once watched floods rise, who once prayed for calm, who once pressed symbols into clay. The connection is subtle, but it's real. And perhaps this is where we leave the story, not with certainty and not with finality, but with stillness. With the understanding that the ruins of old cities do not speak in answers, only in gentle reminders that we are part of a much longer cycle than we can fully comprehend. The wind still moves across those ruins in quiet patterns, carrying dust from one age into another. The stars still watch without judgment, repeating their paths with patient clarity. And stone still remembers, holding traces of hands that reached for meaning in a world both familiar and strange. So rest in that thought, that somewhere beyond the edge of sight, ancient places continue their slow conversation with time, and you are simply listening to one thread of it. Rest in the knowledge that some stories never end, they only become quieter. And as the night deepens, let the last image settle gently. Wind still moving over ruins. Stars still watching. Stone still remembering.